All right. Hi, everyone. I'm Arjun. I'm coming to you from San Francisco in the Bay Area in California today, Saturday morning. And I'm going to be presenting 4 perspectives on elite polarization since 1970. So as a quick overview, I'm going to kind of go over my research question, the key things we're kind of looking at, and we'll look at some key definitions, some terms, some ideas that frame the discussion of polarization. Then we'll actually look at what the 4 perspectives themselves are. We'll look at some kind of results of data analysis before moving on to conclusions and broadscapes kind of looking to the future. So really, why should we care about polarization? Why is it something that I chose to study for months? Well, to me, it's because polarization is an often overlooked but really potent threat to democracy. Political polarization is often decried as the kind of reason why government can't work for us. It's often called the reason why there's so much gridlock in Washington. Disagreement within our lawmakers has often been called the reason why people in America, for example, don't trust our government as much as we used to. So I endeavored to study polarization and kind of put us within historical context in terms of polarization. So I landed on my research question: what has been the trajectory of elite polarization in American politics since the 1970s? And what does that indicate about our current situation vis-a-vis polarization? So 2 things kind of frame this discussion and this question. The first is the time frame aspect from the 1970s onwards. So the 1970s onwards allows 2 things. It kind of creates a more modern American political alignments in terms of parties. And then also, in a more data sense, from the 1970s onwards, there were new record-keeping practices that allowed us to have more specific data access. The second is this discussion of elite polarization. So in the literature, there is a distinction between what is called mass polarization and elite polarization. Mass polarization, as the name kind of suggests, is within the populace. So in this case, this would be the American voters, and is often measured by survey data, which can be suspect to sort of biases and other sort of systemic failures. On the other hand, we have elite polarization, which is within the political elites. So in the United States, this would be our House of Representatives members and our senators. So, 535 people at a time versus millions and millions of people at a time. And that much smaller focus allows what we've called systematic macro level data measures, which really just means that we can examine things like voting history and take a much more closer look at every single person in this set, which we just can't possibly do with people who aren't in the public domain and they're just regular sort of everyday people. So what are the 4 perspectives themselves? Well, they're really just kind of 4 data sets that kind of frame the discussion of polarization. The first 2 sort of quantify polarization, and the second 2 look at the effects of polarization. The first one is aggregate polarization, which kind of shows you how ideologically separate the 2 major American political parties are. So how, ideologically separate are the Democratic and Republican parties. Congressional cooperation shows you how much do the 2 parties work together in terms of the legislative process, how much do they work together to move bills through that process. Congressional effectiveness kind of gives you a picture of how productive each Congress was and kind of what its output looked like. And then economic data is kind of, your cut and dry inflation and unemployment data for the United States. And, nothing too special there. So in terms of aggregate polarization, the graph itself is kind of pretty simple, but very, very important. It shows you that over time, we've seen a consistent increase in the ideological difference between our 2 parties. So as we've moved on and gotten closer to the present, our 2 parties have moved further and further apart in terms of ideology, indicating an increase in sort of polarization in ideology. Our first congressional cooperation graph doesn't really show you too much. It indicates that our levels of congressional cooperation have stayed around 45 to 65% Democratic co-sponsors on every bill, showing you a consistency over time. But our second congressional cooperation graph indicates a really important trend. So this graph shows you what percentage of bills that pass Congress could be categorized as partisan bills. Partisan bills are bills that have had between 0 and 10% of their co-sponsors being Democrats, or 90 and 100% of their co-sponsors being Democrats. And a co-sponsor is someone who signs onto a bill at its earliest stages of introduction into Congress. So what these 2 sort of extremes indicate is that partisan bills are those that are favored, by a vast majority by just one party, meaning that partisan bills represent the ideology of one party much more over the ideology of the other party, which means as we've gotten closer to the present, we've seen on average bills more and more representing the ideology of one party and more of our output representing the ideology of one party over the other party and over sort of bipartisan legislative decision-making. Then we move on to kind of economic data. This is, your inflation graph for the United States, nothing too special here. And the same is true for our unemployment graph here. The reason these two graphs in this whole data set is included is because we're trying to identify whether or not there is a correlation between economics and polarization, and we'll talk about that sort of correlation with our larger conclusions. So moving on to overall effectiveness, this is our first graph here, which indicates how much more effective the majority party in Congress has been than the minority party. And unsurprisingly, the majority has been able to consistently disenfranchise the minority. In other words, the majority has consistently been more effective and more kind of productive than the minority. This is not really surprising. But at the same time, we don't see too much variation over time. It's been relatively consistent, so no main trends can be taken away from this graph. But here we see a very important trend. So this graph shows you a success rate of legislation, i.e. what percentage of bills that were introduced actually made it into law. But it breaks it down by the importance levels of these bills. So this overall effectiveness data set provides sort of a categorization of each and every bill that has ever been passed into one of three categories. A bill is either commemorative, which means it's really nominal legislation, things like, I don't know, renaming a post office, for example. Or it's significant, which means it's sort of like in the middle, relatively important. A majority of legislation will fall into this category. Or it's significant and substantive. So this is really big, really momentous legislation. Things like the 2008 Financial Recovery Acts would have been significant and substantive pieces of legislation. So this graph shows you what percentage, for example, of commemorative bills were able to pass Congress. And we see here with that gray line, this one right here, that our ability to pass commemorative legislation has significantly increased over time, whereas our ability to pass significant and substantive legislation, that most important category, this line over here, has fallen over time. So we're more able to pass less important legislation and less able to pass more important legislation. This graph here corroborates that trend in a much more blown up, convoluted version, which kind of shows you as well that majority-minority disenfranchisement. So we can kind of draw the same conclusions. And those conclusions are corroborated by this graph. This graph kind of shows you essentially, for example, in the 104th Congress, what percentage of all output was significant and substantive, or what percentage of total output was commemorative. So this line over here, this lighter blue line, shows you what percentage of output was commemorative. And we see that over time that has kind of increased, right? So that least important set of results, the least important types of bills, have become more and more of the productive output of Congress. On the other hand, this line over here represents our significant and substantive legislation. So as we've moved further ahead in time, less and less of our productive output has been the significant and substantive, very important pieces of legislation. So that's a lot of data. That's a lot of things altogether. So we'll take a look at kind of four main conclusions that can be drawn when we sort of aggregate all the perspectives. And so the first one is that polarization has increased. We can see that from our aggregate polarization graph, that parties have become ideologically more and more disseparate. We also see that over time, congressional cooperation has become less and less happening. Like there's less and less congressional cooperation. We see more and more partisan bills that favor one party over the other. So our two quantification measures of polarization are indicating that since the 1970s, we've had an increase in polarization almost centered in a linear method. Then we see that polarization directly relates to less important output, right? That's that overall effectiveness story that we just told. We see that as we've become more polarized over time, we see less and less of our ability to pass important output and less of our output actually being important output, right? So we see a really strong correlation between polarization and the importance of our output. As for that economic question that I mentioned really briefly, unfortunately, it does not seem like there is sort of any correlation between political polarization, specifically elite polarization, and economics. This is really because we've seen that sort of trajectory of increase in polarization since the 1970s. And since the 1970s, we've seen both strong economies and weak economies kind of go back and forth. So we don't seem to see any sort of correlation between economics and polarization. Finally, that kind of last part of the question was, well, where does that put us with polarization in the future? And unfortunately, our predictive analysis seems to indicate that polarization is only going to continue to rise. The reason for this really goes back to our quantification measures, right? Our aggregate polarization graph has increased over the entirety of this project's time period, despite everything that has happened in the last 50 years. So we don't see anything coming in the next decades that is really going to reduce or reverse that trend. And so we can predict that that is going to continue to increase. Furthermore, our congressional cooperation graph indicates an increase in partisanship of bills. Nothing seems to be coming that is going to drastically decrease that. Furthermore, when we match our current time period with a historical time period, we see and predict 13 Congresses of consecutive increase in partisan bills. So that's not a very, positive outlook. We seem to be predicting more and more polarization. So I think it's really important and really vital that we keep in mind that polarization is not something that we should forget about, not something that we should stop sort of focusing on, really, because it can be such a detrimental, dangerous force. Thank you all for listening. I wanted to give a really big thanks to my mentor for helping me with this project. And yeah, thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I just have one question. What do you think could possibly contribute to a change in polarization trends, or maybe a disruption in your predicted trends? Is there anything?
Yeah, so I guess there's two ways I can answer this question. The first is when you look at like the data, there are a few times, very few times that trend is sort of reversed, and one of them was 2001. So, the September 11th attacks did cause like a reversal in the trend of polarization. We saw suddenly people are working together more because it's sort of it's an event that precipitates more sort of, looking inwards and working together with everyone in the country because it's an attack. But, you can't use that to solve polarization. So um, sort of another way that I think may actually be sort of effective is a much more grassroots solution to sort of promote sort of cooperation at a much younger level, at a much earlier level than try to work with, at the highest levels of government. So instead, if you try to, increase sort of discussion between, people who are coming up in politics and sort of so that they can learn and work together with people so that when they reach the highest levels, and they're, our lawmakers, they have the ability to work with people, and really kind of form more bipartisan legislation.
Great insights. Thank you so much for presenting.